This is a City Council workshop for January 17th, 2024. City Clerk, would you do the roll call, please?
Councilmember Sell.
Here.
Councilmember Papalardo. Here. Councilmember Stevenson.
Here.
Mayor Chazet.
Here.
Vice Mayor Butlin.
Here. All right, the focus of the workshop this evening is a staff presentation of an overview of Chapter 5 of the proposed Land Development Code. This is the code that we are rewriting during the development moratorium. So, Mr. Bapp.
Yes, ma'am. Stephen Bapp, Growth Management Director. So today, as the mayor announced, this will be a workshop. How I see this workshop running, first of all, let me go over some of the tools you've been provided. First set of tools I provided earlier came via the normal agenda posting. That would be the Chapter 5, the full 100 and something page document, which is what we call the clean version. Also to my left, we have the strike-through version. If there's any questions like, was this a change or is this just a transfer over, we can answer those questions at the time. Also provided in front of you is about 37 piece slide presentation, which I'll give you as the overview. Also, we have available the full land development code if we need to look at something that's not related to Chapter 5. And we also have the staff, which has been very instrumental in getting us this far once the contractor handed off the LDC. We have Marilyn Thomas, our senior planner, who's also a certified architect, who's been very instrumental in designing some of the illustrations. Joseph Barker, our senior planner, very experienced in other land development codes throughout the country. We have Caleb Burney, who really helped facilitate a lot of the work with our contractor getting us to this point. We have Richard Villasenor, our city engineer, who did help quite a bit with Chapter 5, especially with some of the stormwater issues we have. Also not seated are Patty Von Holland, who is our code enforcement officer, who's provided a lot of real life experience to our code. And we have Yoandi Flores, who has been very instrumental too, who is one of our city engineers. So I just want to thank the staff for getting us to this point, and no other further ado, we will proceed. Today we'll cover 5 points, really an overview. I'm not going to go line by line of the code because that would be about a 2-week class. So let's go through first the introduction, background, purpose, intent, go over what form-based code really is and how it can apply to our city, and give discussion at the end. How I see this culminating is we will capture whatever comments that the council has. And if there are further things when you leave, you're like, man, I should ask them about section 522 or I have some comments on this. Please do provide those by email to Carmen, our city manager, and we'll give about a 7-day window. So 7 days from this date. If you have any comments within that time, please provide them to Carmen. We'll consolidate those comments, get answers for them, and at the beginning of our next workshop, I'll have those up item by item. And it could be, yes, we've covered it, we've integrated your comments, or that's not maybe feasible based on our land development, other aspects of our code or whatever. So we'll address those before going into chapters 1, 2, and 3, which will be our next workshop a month from today. So with all that, I'll be followed by Marilyn Thomas, who'll give you, no, I wouldn't put her on the spot. So our code, I'm going to go over Chapter 5, which is located on the right of the screen that you see, which are overlay districts. A lot of this was gathered from our current code, and consolidated was the first step. So as you see in our current code, we had overlay districts in our Chapter 3, we had gateway standards in Chapter 5, and we had the TOD itself also in Chapter 5. We bring those into a new Chapter 5, and then we add form-based code districts, nodes, and corridors, which will really be the main part of form-based codes in the new LDC. Why did we start with 5 instead of 1? Because I think this is probably the most complex to understand. It incorporates a lot of other elements of the old code into the new code, and it adds the form-based code. So I wanted to get kind of everyone's thought process around this as we move forward with the LDC review. So some background to this. First, I mentioned corridors, and what our principal corridors are corridors that we will refer to in the Land Development Code, which are already referred to, but will continue to be referred to, are the 1792 corridor, the High Banks Road corridor, which goes west to east, Enterprise Road, which is a small portion really within our city limits, and then Saxon Boulevard, another small portion really in our city, and then the Dirksen Drive, which goes from 1792 to Interstate 4. Just a reflection, I'm sure you're all very familiar with the corridor, but anybody viewing online will see what we refer to as the South 1792 corridor. A lot of buildings, a lot of structures, a lot of different forms, really a lot of different construction periods. We have some construction that's really recent, within the last 10 years. We have some that goes very back, predating probably the 1960s. The corridor north, really the same type of, I'm in sync. Really the same type of conditions, some older, some newer, all intermixed. And then we have our High Banks node. Our High Banks node extends really from the Winn-Dixie Plaza south to Colombo Road, which is really kind of the core of our village, and the rest of our village extends out from that portion. We have High Banks Road, which begins with a marina in the west and terminates really with an industrial type complex in the east. Really different various mix of uses. A lot of kind of residential abutting it, but that's our High Banks Road corridor. We can't forget Enterprise Road and Saxon, which are really a small portion of our city. We share a lot of this boundary of these roads with Orange City to our north, but it is still part of our corridor and covered in the Land Development Code. Then last but not least, corridor is really Dirksen. The corridors, if you look at corridors and monitoring corridors by themselves, we don't really focus on integrating the human scale. We really don't integrate on establishing a sense of place. We just give some general zoning requirements that are placed on the corridor. The corridors are kind of operating separately and disjointed from themselves and really don't flow one corridor into the next. Drilling into the proposed purpose and intent, I'll cover the purpose and intent of Chapter 5, along with kind of how we are already supporting, or how the LDC can support some of the objectives that we're seeking to achieve in the city. I'll give you a minute to look at the purpose and intent. But overall, I would say the purpose and intent of Chapter 5 is to establish harmony between the human element and the built environment. Getting our buildings closer to the road, getting a more walkable environment, and getting a place where people can gather and interact with our fellow residents of the city. We already have this. The Village Center really is, I pulled this out of our city council initiatives. I looked at our city council initiatives and I saw there were about 6 initiatives that received 4 to 5 of our votes from our current city council. Some of the things the city is already well underway with, the Alexander Island property acquisition. We're working to improve our signage in the city. The septic to sewer program, we already have that underway, even though that's a longer term objective. But also 4 to 5 people wanted to have, or council people wanted to have the Village Center redevelopment strategy. And this really supports that strategy. It's under our 5-year strategic initiatives, under the Village Center redevelopment strategy, and it is more specifically a corridor plan for the village overlay area. So this Chapter 5 will support our strategic goals along with being incorporated into the Land Development Code as a permanent codification of our goals. Some things just to be familiar with as we're going through this chapter review. Many people are familiar with zoning, which is on the left. Some are familiar with future land use, which drives zoning. But also the city does have already established overlay districts. Overlay districts are reflected in the center map, and harder for me to read right this second. But I want to make sure I capture them all. The Village Center, which centers around our node, our High Banks and 1792, our south and our north 1792, our south waterfront district, which is really going to remain the same under this node. Our High Banks node, which I mentioned, is really part of our village center and our High Banks. Did I miss one? Am I good? I think I got them, as you can read. But let's talk about form-based code itself. What is form-based code? It's really the relationship between the public realm, which is people, and the facades of the building. It's really the form and mass of the buildings in relation to one another, the scale of the development, and the context is the key rather than the use. Form-based code is a land development regulation, actual regulation, which tries to build a predictable environment, tries to control the growth, what do we want, how do we want it to look. Just an example, conventional zoning is really pretty simple. You can build so far back from the road, so high, and you need to have this many parking spaces. We don't care what anything looks like. When you add zoning design guidelines, you get some articulation, you get some views, a little better look, but you don't get the predictability you would with a form-based code. Because form-based code will drive street and building types, which is the mix, build two lines, which is where the building should be placed on the property, how far, approximal from the transit corridors, the number of floors, and the percentage of build site frontage to be specified. I'll show a short video here. Hopefully this will work. There's no sound to the video, but it kind of takes some of the aspects of what form-based code is. Facades of the building should welcome people, not repel them. So we're adding landscaping, we're separating the vehicular space. We're trying to focus on the orientation of the facades, the public front and the public street. Great streets happen when roads and building designs are matched. So we see without form-based code, we start building up layers. And this is what we're driving to. And we still retain our charm, still retain our original form of our cities, and take that pattern of development and incorporate it into new form, which encourages pedestrians and maintains the original core of the city. We see the stark differences as we start building our layers up. So they pass through to get to somewhere else. We have a destination. Much like we saw it for our Main Street development in our TOD, we're trying to replicate some of that and continue the continuity of that throughout the rest of the corridor. Now I think this should advance. There we go. Some example. We've asked for some examples of who's doing this. There are different examples throughout the state of Florida. Haines City has done it. They've revitalized their central corridor and really started to move to more to the pedestrian scale. But I think the best example that we can drive to in a short distance is Winter Park. Winter Park took an antiquated code in an antiquated part of the city and incorporated a form-based code, which really drew the buildings to the street, put in an interaction with the landscaping and the human scale, and actually had an illustrated plan people can follow. It incorporates a lot of low-impact design concepts, walkability, scalability, and sense of plan, sense of purpose. So I think walking or going and taking a visit to Winter Park would be a good thing to do, just to kind of see where we're trying to guide here. What does form-based code do? It really builds placemaking, places you can assemble, places you can gather, socialize, and interact. It also creates a walkable destination. You can drive to a destination and then launch out from there, walk to the different stores, interact with your local community. Oops, let me go back. You do have this slide in your packet. Some permitted uses in the corridor nodes are indicated based on if it's a corridor, the High Banks Node, the Village Center, or the South 1792. The uses are indicated. A P would mean permitted, N would be not permitted, and S would be a special exception, meaning they would have to come to the council and show how they're not going to, how they would be able to meet the use and not have secondary effects on the community. If there is a use here that has went from permitted to non-permitted, it would fall under the nonconformity clause, which means the use would continue in perpetuity until abandoned down the line. So a use could be here today, not be reflected on the chart, and 100 years from now still be there if it's not abandoned. So you don't really lose rights. Rezonings happen, so that's why we have nonconformity clauses, not only for uses, but also for buildings and site features too. Based on our interaction with Inspire and some staff fine tuning, we're really looking at using the form-based codes and dividing them into 3 different segments. Segment 1, which is indicated in green, which would be your High Banks corridor, your North 1792, majority of your South 1792, or all of your South 1792 minus the TOD, and then Dirksen. Then you have segment 2, which is our Village Center. Goes from really the Winn-Dixie area south of Colombo Road. And then you have the blue area on there, which is already the existing TOD. Now, the existing TOD in all the Land Development Code review, I think has remained about 99% of what we already have. There's a few minor changes, which I'll go over later. But we're going to have 3 specific segments to evaluate projects. Now, let's take, for example, how we've built our building setbacks under the new form-based code and the new land development code. So as you see, we'll have a, let's take, for example, in the bottom left chart, we have minimum front setback. Under segment 1, the minimum setback would be 10 feet. So we're less restrictive, and we're bringing buildings closer in our village center by moving the minimum front setback to 5 feet. Then under segment 3, we'll have its own section of the within the TOD code, which is already existing. So you see we have different requirements for the different segments. As you get closer to the village center, we get more of a walkable, scalable, interacting type environment. As you get out in other segments, you have less, you have more of a suburban type setting. Streetscape zones. We've seen streetscape zones in our TOD, which have the outlay of the transportation zone, the landscaping zone, the walking zone or the pedestrian zone, and then the private zone, which is your street cafes and things like that. Also in the land development code, we're going to give the different setbacks for these zones. Building orientation is shown in the right center. We're going to discourage, really trying to discourage the parking from being in the front and having rear-based parking with our building orientations, the majority of the facade towards the public rights of way. Also, Chapter 5 covers many areas of building design standards, which I'll go over, but you can see the bulletized list on the far left. There are illustrations in Chapter 5, which kind of give the don't do this, but do this. We do go over architecture, which is festernation, roof line pitches, percent of transparency in storefronts, primary entrance locations, building materials and colors, and the illustration on the bottom of the screen is an extract from our proposed Chapter 5 of the Land Development Code. Also, we've covered building height to not exceed 3 floors. We've given direction for building frontage and design, and we've included things that are often excluded, like, well, what if you have a balcony? How does that come into the scale? What if we have canopies? How does that come in? A lot of these things were left out in our code, but with modern design, we're trying to encourage balconies, trying to encourage people to be interactive with the street, and we've included them in Chapter 5, as we did in the TOD regulations. We've also covered most of your other type activities like arcades. Arcades will be given their dimensional requirements based on the zone, stoop dimensions, and porch dimensions, which were excluded from the Land Development Code, but will be included in the new Land Development Code. Also often, which was excluded from our current code, is, well, what do you do with your service areas? What do you do with your mechanical things? What do you do with your power boxes? Right now, they can be out in the open. They can be unscreened. Now we've written regulations which will cover that, so it's more pedestrian friendly. It attracts more people to the street. We've also covered things like rooftop screening and minor details like which were often excluded, which were excluded in the code, but now covered in the new code. As we did about 6 months ago when we rewrote the self-storage facilities and designed guidelines and requirements for the self-storage facilities, we also have layout designs required for new drive-through facilities, layout designs designated for new gas stations, which we can go over in detail as required. Chapter 5 also for the overlay and the nodes includes access, circulation, and parking requirements, putting the parking in the back, but also giving credit for shared parking uses. We have a matrix on the bottom left, which will cover if we have retail interacting with residential, what the sharing factor would be. We also include lighting standards, which were not included in the current Land Development Code, and pedestrian accesses, which were not included in the current Land Development Code. Chapter 5 has its own chapter specifically for the corridors, overlays, and nodes, which covers the landscaping, the parking lot landscaping, street trees, wall fences, and the like. Also, we've incorporated low-intensity development aspects into our stormwater management. That means green plants for percolation rather than a solid concrete canal. Many things which have been proven very successful in other parts of Florida, we're going to incorporate into the new code for the corridor overlay zones. This has really worked a lot in concert with Richard Villasenor and his water management background and expertise, and also a lot of the LID community. We've garnered a lot of their best practices from them. So I said the TOD was 99% complete already. We working with the TOD so far as a staff. We really wanted to add just a couple minor things. One big thing were porch principles, meaning how high should the porch be when it's next to a sidewalk. You don't want to have a zero porch height on your sidewalk. You want to have a little bit of elevation. And this gives a scope and scale of how high the porch should be in relationship to the sidewalk. That's just one example, and that was excluded from the TOD, but we're going to add it into our TOD. We're also going to add, we didn't have mention of mansard roofs. Mansard roofs are like you see, I guess it's really a flat top building with a roof coming, a fake roof coming on the front. We're excluding those from a roof type. Also clarified some administrative rezoning, added languages clarifying conditions for approving waivers, removed funeral services from the outside core of the TOD, and added the height requirement of 12 feet for commercial buildings, first floor in the TOD. So those things were added, or proposed to be added in this version of the TOD. So that was kind of everything in a nutshell I wanted to present to you tonight. We really want to get some feedback, take your notes tonight, look forward to getting more input via email as you can ponder and think about some things. And well, I know a lot of times you leave and have these things and get that email within 7 days. And we're here with our staff to answer questions that you may have.
Okay. City Clerk, do we have any public participation?
No, ma'am, we do not.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much, Mr. Bapp, for this presentation and for the detail that we got in our agenda packet. I definitely think we're on the correct path, but I look forward to the input from my fellow council members. Councilmember Sell, questions, comments?
So one time I don't like going first. It's a lot to absorb. I love all of it, actually. I mean, I wish if it didn't cost any money, we could just erase what we got and make it happen, but we can't. I know right now when we walk our dog, we try to walk it, you know, on Seminole Drive and Shell Road a little bit. And we just don't feel safe when we walk our dogs out on 1792 on that sidewalk. But, you know, something like this, it does make you feel more comfortable when you're walking and you're not looking back all the time to see if there's a car coming or how close they're coming, with the trees and the setback. And you just feel more welcome. I mean, I've been to a few downtown areas, and there are some that I envy that are just, they just did it right, you know, with the lampposts and the trees, the setbacks, the murals on the buildings. I mean, I think Canal Street, New Smyrna has a little of that. I don't think that it's all the way like that, but you know, Winter Park is, you feel like you're safe when you're walking downtown there in Winter Park. You can walk, you can park and walk to just about anywhere you want down there, which is great too. I just, my questions are some of the older parts of 1792 where is our end game and our goal to eventually try to get the new downtown and maybe the center part of the city here to kind of start to match each other eventually? You can't take a business owner and force them to, you know, hey, look, this is what we're doing tomorrow, you know. But is that over time something we're trying to do?
Right, to answer your question, yes. We did note that there are a lot of disjoining regulations of all the corridors and the overlays. We're trying to make it more harmonious. Yes, I mean, it is a long-term thing. That's why we have long-term goals, objectives, and strategies. And that would be a long-term objective. We could have a downtown, we could have an uptown. We'd maybe have a midtown of some looking like something. That's really the objective of the form-based codes and where we're trying to drive this train. We realize as staff and as citizens that this is not a 2-year project. This is the long-term, something we're going to pass on to our kids and grandkids. So we do realize that.
Councilmember Sell, I think that the city manager has something to add to that as well.
Well, yes, but this is a 20, 30, 40, 50-year deal. And it depends on the market and the economy, et cetera, et cetera. We are planning, as we look over the landscape, the next 5 years, the city is going to be totally built out. Then what? And then you start working on redevelopment. And what does that look like? One of the most unique questions I get all the time is, why are all the buildings on 1792 crooked? And crooked meaning they're angled and everything else. And so what this code does for the long term is, if somebody should buy these particular properties, now it's going to be very difficult to redevelop in our core area because the lots are so small and they don't necessarily meet the environmental standards. So it's going to ultimately take somebody buying 2 or 3 properties together and then joining them together to rebuild. But what is that rebuild going to look like? Well, this is what this code does. It says, okay, this rebuild is going to have to look like this. If your buildings are all crooked, no, they're going to have to be square it up to 1792. Your parking's going to have to be in the back. You're going to have these landscaping standards. And the new projects are going to look in these, like these pictures here that you see. And so some of these buildings that were built in the 40s and 50s that have the angles and everything else, yeah, you drive by them and there's a lot of inconsistency. And so that's what this does, provides consistency. But just for folks that are watching or will watch this video, this is not a 2 or 3 year project. This is 20, 30, 40 years. Ultimately, at some point, the property values are going to be higher in DeBary. Folks want to live in DeBary or do business in DeBary, and that demand and the price to get in is going to be very expensive. And that demand to try to get into DeBary is going to cause redevelopment once the land is all gone. Does that make sense?
It does. I just don't want people to go, oh my, that's it. They're going to force us to do this and that. And
Nope, everything stays the same until you make a change.
I mean, this completely makes sense. We might not be alive to actually see any of it come to fruition, but it is a great idea.
It's part of your legacy.
Yeah. Right. Thank you so much,
You're welcome.
all you guys. Yeah, it's. I know this was not done overnight, and it's a lot of work. So, but I appreciate it. Yeah. I wish we could change everything overnight, but we can't. So.
Councilmember Papalardo.
So I'm very impressed with what we've seen tonight. One of the things I say often is I'm afraid of the Village Core District being left behind as the TOD comes to fruition. I think this is going to definitely help with that transition as you move north along 1792. I feel like South 1792 is a major opportunity for improvement in general. It already feels a little bit left behind from much of the rest of town. This paired with the potential of FDOT and potentially federal improvements to the Complete Streets project on 1792, being prepared for when those changes go into place, that hopefully we see further investment and redevelopment. I feel optimistic about the outlook. It's just kind of unfortunate driving up 1792 sometimes, and you just wish things were a little bit more cohesive. And I'm glad that we're putting the foundation in place to get to that point. And granted, it will be a matter of decades, but you got to start somewhere. Thank you.
Councilmember Stevenson.
Yes, first I'd like to just echo appreciation for the amount of detail that I'm sure you guys had to go through. I would be interested in seeing the strike-through copy, if you guys could send that.
Yeah, we can do that. We'll distribute that out.
Sure, thank you. And I could see now that the city manager said this is for more redevelopment, not that this is an immediate requirement for some of these zones where they're not going to have to make these changes overnight. But if there was a new owner or if they were planning a major remodeling, then they would have to meet the new codes, correct?
That's correct.
Well, I think that might not be totally correct. City Manager, do you want to clarify that?
Well, typically, we
If
have a
it
project-
continues in the same business, even if you sell it, I don't think you're forced to change.
No, and typically, and Mr. Babb can correct me if I'm wrong, but if you change at least 50% of your project, the value of your particular project, there's a trigger there that will send you to development review. And so there are certain triggers there that will do that. But if you buy a business and you want to remodel it and remodel the inside, those are not, and if you don't cross that 50% threshold, then that's then I think you're pretty safe from this particular code. But we have a project now. You may know the old Bank of America building. Well, they crossed the 50% threshold, and they went from a building permit to development review. And because they crossed the 50% threshold, and if you read in here, it's every 5 years. So you have a 5-year window. So if you cross the 50% threshold, then that certainly has a bearing on going through a development review. And then certainly a lot of these things are scrutinized, and you got to meet the code. So
Right. Thank you. That was what I was going to state. Yeah, there are thresholds. Also for nonconformity, you have basically nonconforming structures which means the building doesn't meet the setback or it's too tall, you can keep that building as long as it'll stand up. But once it comes down to a degradation or you have to reconstruct more than 50% of the building, or you try to increase the portion that's non-conforming, you can't increase the non-conforming portion. But once you do trigger that 50% valuation threshold, then you have to make that particular thing conforming, whether it's a site thing like landscaping, or if it's a site or structure like a building. Then also for non-conformity, you have a use. Let's say imaginary use A. All of a sudden, imaginary use A is no longer permitted because it's been replaced by other uses. You can continue that use, pass it to your children, pass it to your great-grandchildren. As long as they keep up use A, that can stay in use. But let's say your descendants no longer want to have that use, they give it up. After 6 months, it's considered no longer, it triggers that threshold, and then that use would go away. So
Kinda
you have
like what we
structures and
did with
site
the-
things, and you have uses.
Like what we did with the automobile sales in the
Correct,
downtown
like we did
core.
for the automobile sales in the Village Center.
So that was going to be one of my other questions you started touching on, as far as on this page with the permitted uses. How many of those have changed from non-permitted, and if that would be included in the strikeouts?
Yeah,
for
that
review?
is included in the strikeout. There are a few that were, the status of the use change may have gone to a special exception or may have gone to a non-permitted. There are a few that really didn't promote the goals and objectives of the Village Center redevelopment, may not promote the objectives of our form-based codes. But we do have that in the strike-through version, and we can give you a rundown maybe we'll give you the strike-through version, and we'll give you a rundown of
Sure, and also,
what's
if it changed the kind of thinking behind why it was
okay.
changing.
Yeah, we can do that. That's not a problem at all.
And then as far as the building setbacks, okay, so that would be the same thing. They don't have to change it if they don't meet it, but you're changing it and making it smaller of a setback on 1792?
Right, well, what we're doing is, okay, traditional automobile-based construction back in the 50s, 60s, 70s was we're going to go everywhere in automobile. We want to have our parking up front so we can zip in with our Continental, walk to the store, jump on a car, back onto the road, and go out. Well, we're discouraging that. That doesn't really encourage people to walk their dog, bring their golf carts down, and it doesn't really give you a sense of place. So we're moving the buildings from set far back with parking in the front to move them to the street. So you're feeling like you're interacting with the built environment, parking in the back. So that's kind of a vignette to storytelling, but that's what we're doing. So
Okay.
that building can stay there for 100 years, but if it hits that threshold, then it comes up to the street, parking goes from the front to the back, and we start with the new regulations of Chapter 5.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
most cities have eliminated the old shopping centers where everything was in the back, and you see this massive parking lot all the way across the front. Those a lot of cities have kind of eliminated those and broken things up a little bit where the buildings are on the front, and it breaks up the parking in sections, so it just doesn't look like a massive asphalt lot that you're looking at, so.
Okay. I think my last question would be, as far as the corridors, why is Meadowlea in its own little overlay district, and not other small RV type
I
Trailer.
honestly-
Isn't it, it's
Areas.
waterfront?
And it's got waterfront?
It's got a harbor, it's got a marina and dock like High Banks Marina does. To me, the reason it has that is because of the waterfront nature,
Yeah.
not necessarily
The
the
High
kind of
Banks
housing.
Marina would also then be?
It has its own center,
Yes.
too. It's in
Okay.
your
They both
your
do
data.
exactly why the mayor explained. That's
Yeah.
Okay,
that's
well,
why
that
they
makes
do.
sense.
There's a whole, matter of fact, it has to deal with the Live Local Act, to be honest with you. I hate to say those three words, but references recreational and commercial working waterfronts. And it's Chapter 342, if I remember, in the Florida statutes, and governs all type of recreational and commercial on waterfront property. And so that's why those are there. They have a marina down in Meadowlea. And so, yeah, that's governed by the working waterfront statute. And so is High Banks
High Banks
Marina.
Marina.
Sorry,
And
and
so-
the Swamp House.
Okay.
And so both of those could be live local apartments if ownership would change? Or could be, for in the case of Meadow Lake, people own their lots.
Yeah,
So
those-
it would be very hard to aggregate and
Yes,
change hands.
You can't get to Meadow A unless you go through their private gates, but
Right.
High Banks Marina certainly is a potential, yes.
Because it's owned, the land is owned by an entity.
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
All right, thank you very much. And again, thank you for the report. And if I'll have any more questions, I'll send an email.
Vice Mayor Butlin.
Hi.
Aye.
I'm going to also say thank you. This is great to have all this up front. When you talk about the village center area, do we have that designated already as to
Yes.
from this street to this street and that?
Absolutely do. We have that on our overlay. We can give you the boundaries. It begins at Colombo Road here.
Right.
Extends north, no?
No, it begins at, the High Banks node begins at Poinsettia and goes to High Banks. It doesn't
The
come
High
down.
Banks, the High Banks
The High
node,
Banks node does. The
Right.
other one,
the village, okay, you have the High Banks node,
right, but something has to go to Poinsettia.
High Banks node.
High Banks goes to Poinsettia, then something else goes.
That's the village.
That's the
the
village
village
center.
Village
I'm
center.
asking at the
Yeah,
village.
okay.
I just wasn't sure what the.
But it goes up to, Poinsettia is the divider from the High Banks node to the next node, correct?
Use them, I can't hear you. Give her the microphone.
Village Center overlay is from High Banks Road to Plantation Road. Yeah,
Okay.
But what is the poinsettia in your document?
that is the limits for High Banks node.
That's, okay, High Banks node has separate uses permitted from the one that expands to Plantation, is that correct?
Yes, it would
Okay.
have a little more additional
Correct.
restrictions on uses.
Yeah, so there's a node within the
Right,
segment.
within the,
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
yeah, I was just trying to figure out what that village center area was designated as. I also had I forget about the angled buildings. I've been asking for that for 30 years. I've only lived here 14. I have a question on developers coming in. They come in, boilerplate, Dollar Tree, Dollar General, whatever they are, Family Dollar. They come in, they're boilerplated. If they don't meet the guidelines and the setbacks and all that stuff that we have now currently going to change, that means they have to come in for a special exception?
If it's permitted, if it's not
Yeah.
permitted, they
So,
can't even do
okay.
that.
Let me, so are you asking, if someone comes in with a site plan that doesn't meet this chapter 5,
Correct.
what we're proposing? Well, they have two choices. They meet chapter 5 or they
Move somewhere else?
go somewhere else.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's the bottom
I'll
line.
give you an example. Mr. Clean,
Yeah, thank you.
they're a boilerplate. Well, it
Right.
didn't turn out to be boilerplate. The building was moved forward, the parking's in the back, because if you go through, and I hate to use other cities, but you go through Orange City, all the vacuum stuff is in the front. And that's all you see, all those hoses, and the cars from there. Mr. Clean, the building's moved to the front, the hoses and vacuum stuff's in the back, and everything else. And so it all changed, even though they're a boilerplate company, they either changed or they don't build there.
But that was our guidelines that they changed to make
Yes.
sure that they fit there.
Correct.
Okay, that's what I
We
wanted to
did
make sure.
have some corridor overlay zone guidelines that drove that. But yes, they would have to come in, they would have to comply, or they would not proceed forward to receive a development order.
And then the other thing I questioned, I didn't see, and maybe it's not in this chapter, I don't know, but our sign ordinance. We have monument signs right now with the new setbacks and everything. Where does that fit in? Is that something that's changing down the road in a couple months when we go through that, or is that still part of chapter, or segment 5?
So signs, all signage will be in chapter 11.
Thank you.
Correct? Yeah, yeah.
I just-
So there were signs scattered throughout the Land Development Code too, our current Land Development Code, so we're going to take all those bits and pieces and put them in our new chapter 5. Yep.
And I
So
don't-
that will address monument signs, any,
Yeah.
menu
Well, if you're
type
changing-
signs, wall signs,
wall
roofs,
signs.
no roof signs,
Okay.
thank God.
So, because if you're changing the setbacks, the monuments really become a problem.
Correct.
I would say.
Right.
The only other thing I questioned was, I know it may not be, it's not really part of this, but the facade grants. We had offered that at one point, or we talked about that, giving grants for changing facades currently, and not necessarily in the redevelopment, but current standards. Is that something that's never been just squashed for now?
We haven't brought that to council. That's probably my fault there, that we've been saving the money. We haven't spent the BTR money, but
Okay.
one of the unique things about DeBerry is we take the BTR monies and we roll them back into the commercial businesses. A lot of cities just don't do that. And so, yeah, we've been planning a facade grant there. We've been piling the money up to do a facade grant. We didn't do it the first year because honestly, it wasn't a whole lot of money. We were just going to waste our time. So we'll get that accomplished. One of the things the legislature has this year is to eliminate BTRs and BTR revenues, and so
That's my question.
we may just do a one-time facade and just dedicate all that money to commercial businesses there on
And the
7th.
only other one thing I had was, I'm a big typo person. High Banks is one word. When you're doing your slides, I don't know where that's going to show up anywhere else, but High Banks is one word, not two. That's just
Understand.
me and my proofreading. That's it for me. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank
Okay.
you, thank you.
First of all, thank you very much, and I do like this approach. I'm really excited to get the low-impact design on the stormwater. That's an aside, as I think that this whole approach, over time, and this may be what we give our children and our grandchildren, but over time, this will get the unified front along our main corridors that we would like to see. But it will preserve the existing businesses. And if the business is sold and it stays exactly as it is or has only minor changes, it continues to be grandfathered in. Just as we grandfathered in many things. DeBerry Nursery, it would not be permittable, but it was grandfathered in when that code changed. And Beverly can sell it to, and her husband can sell it to whoever they want, as long as it stays the way it is, it can stay. But should they abandon the nursery business for more than 6 months, then we start from scratch. That property can no longer be a nursery, and it would have to be one of the uses that's permitted in that part of the corridor, and it would have to meet, any buildings would have to meet that, rather than being one of the most attractive steel buildings I've ever seen as far as for a retail space. She really has a lovely business. It's not a business we would ever permit again. That's the nature of how things change. So I do like that we get there in a methodical way and do not abridge people's rights along the way. One reason why I'm really familiar with where the High Banks node ends is we may have a one-off here or there that we have to address through this process. I am aware of an undeveloped property in the High Banks node, and that property was on the market for 2.5 years. And that property finally went under contract just prior to us doing the moratorium. And it was for a use that was permitted. And if this passes the way it is written and the way I support, that use is not permitted. So you have a property owner who had a property, who tried to get a marketplace offer for the property for a very long period of time in a public way, finally got an offer, has a contract in hand that predates this official exercise. And I have encouraged the city manager and our development staff to work with this situation. I think this is a one-off. It doesn't undercut the merit of all of this, but it goes from a permitted to an N. It's not something that even can come in front of us for a special exception. And so that may be an effect for an existing landowner in our community that we should not, that we should handle separately and in a special way. Yes, that may give us a business that we don't want going forward, and yes, we're under a moratorium. But these are very unusual circumstances for a single property. So my encouragement would be for the city manager and your department, Mr. Bapp, to work with the situation, which I've described to both of you, and figure out what a fair solution is for that particular interest. Now, perhaps that proposed use, the buyer's use, was permitted when they bought it, and now would not be permitted when we pass this, as I expect we will, or certainly have a high chance of, based on the comments here tonight. You know, they might find in the development review process that they can't even put that business where they want it. And they haven't gotten to that part yet. So there's many moving parts with it, but I would encourage you to handle that. There's plenty of time to address a single situation.
Mayor, just,
Yes.
I'll comment a little bit on, if you
Sure.
don't mind, on, you know, this land development code. We're going through a bunch of workshops, and at the
Correct.
end, there'd be 2 formal public hearings.
Correct.
And there'll be an ordinance drafted, and any of those little issues that, as far as implementation is concerned, can be addressed in the ordinance.
Right.
So-
I'm just asking up front, having identified one at this workshop, that one would either be amicably settled with the people involved, so that it doesn't prevent this from moving forward with that particular use being banned in general, or that an amicable solution can be found where it's drafted in the ordinance, or a close inspection of the business plan shows it's not possible anyway. And all these things could be something that staff and these affected parties could work out, I hope. And you're right, it can be incorporated in the ordinance if we need to do some kind of exception. Other than that, I do like all of the changes. I would invite you to think about what in the High Banks note it might mean if Aldi's closed and was no longer a grocery store. It's owned by Aldi's now. You know, what if something triggered this with a renovation for another kind of business, then the whole building comes forward and the parking goes to the back. That would be an interesting development in that shopping center. Perhaps it's a huge hypothetical, I understand, but perhaps we ought to think about that situation and what would be a reasonable outcome. That is one of the old kinds of setups where we put all the parking in the front, we ran all the businesses around the back. And I'm not saying what the solution would be, but it may bear at least some minor thought and consideration in your department as to that particular sizable asset in the center of our community. Now, Aldi's is very well grounded. I expect they may be there a long time. They have a great customer base here, but it is a shopping center that if anything substantial happened to it, would have to meet these, and it would be a completely different place. In the end, that might be good, but we might want to think about what it looks like on the way there.
Okay.
So other than that, I have, on the TOD minor changes, these will apply only to applications that have not yet been started until the time we implement it, whenever that is, late this spring, correct?
Correct. How the business rule works, or any application that's in development review or the city
Right.
hopper would be processed under
The existing.
today's land development
Yeah.
code. Anything received after the adoption of the new ordinance would be
Right.
executed or.
So within the
follow that.
TOD, anything accepted from now until we would pass ordinances in June or July will still be under the existing standards.
Because they came in with a,
Because they came in but prior to us changing, and you don't have any plan to take the TOD changes and do them separately, since we do not have a moratorium in that
Well,
hard to
we
say.
don't have a moratorium in there, so,
I said we don't have a moratorium, so that's what I'm saying.
yeah, the effective date would be July 1, or whenever.
Whenever
the
we do,
Ordinance, and so anything applied up to that time will still be under the old code until
Correct.
we get the ordinance passed.
I was just clarifying that for people who might have a question, since the TOD is carved out of the current moratorium.
Yep.
Okay, I don't have anything further unless you want any wrap-up comments or city manager does.
No, it just finally, so just get a little few minutes break here so we can get the IT guys to switch over. But it's, again, correspond with me individually. We'll get you out the strike-through version and make your comments, and we'll answer them at the next workshop and go from there.
Thank you very much, and with that, the workshop is adjourned.